Okay, we are going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, What is Hidden in Your Microsoft 365? We appreciate you joining us today. And the first thing I always like to do is just take a second to introduce our speakers. My name is Shayna Horka, and I work in product marketing here at Gimmal. And I'm joined by our key speaker today, Director of Sales Engineering, Dean Misenhimer. Before we get started, I have a couple of housekeeping items to go through. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, feel free to submit them in the Q&A section on your screen, and we will answer as many as we have time for at the end of the presentation. There will be at least one poll question that you will see pop up, so please keep an eye out for that. As always, if you have any technical difficulties, please let us know so we can assist you. All right, so to kick things off, I have just one slide here to tell you a little bit about Gimmal and how we can help you take control of your information with our suite of solutions. Founded in 2002, Gimmal is a records, information management, and governance software company that helps you balance the value your information provides with the risk it also presents. Whether you're trying to discover information in unstructured data sources, migrate from legacy systems, or comply with policies across multiple repositories, Gimmal can help you achieve your information governance goals. We have a client success team and a global network of partners that deliver solutions in conjunction with key partners like Microsoft and SAP. Gimmal's family of software products work together to let you create an efficient digital workplace. Our comprehensive suite includes electronic and physical records management, content governance for SharePoint, document management for SAP solutions, file analysis, and migration. But without further ado, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Dean so he can get started with today's presentation.
Thank you, Shayna. So Gimmal and Microsoft have a long history of working together. Gimmal has worked with Microsoft since our early days, initially deploying solutions on the SharePoint platform. Our first software products introduced DoD level records management for the SharePoint platform. And we've continued that now with Microsoft 365 and the cloud. We've worked with Microsoft around compliance and records management, a focus on collaboration and information governance solutions for the Microsoft platform. And today, recently we announced that Gimmal is a preferred partner in Microsoft's Content Services Partner Program, really focused around some of their machine learning and artificial intelligence solutions like Project Cortex, and specifically around Microsoft Syntex. So there's a long history there between the two companies. And, there's a great reason why, and that's simply the platform that Microsoft provides with Microsoft 365. If you look at the platform and all the services that the platform provides, it really does allow companies to reimagine how they're going to do their work using the Microsoft 360 platform. As companies look to move to the cloud, they want a platform that is going to continue to grow and provide future-looking services and expand as they need it to. And Microsoft 365 has become ubiquitous across the Fortune 500. Over 70% of the Fortune 500 have Microsoft 365 in their organization. And there are over 250 million users of Microsoft 365 today. On a daily basis, right? We've all gone to using tools like Microsoft Teams, especially now in a COVID environment where we're all working from home and need to collaborate, need to have kind of that video feed to have that connection. There's over 75 million people daily using Microsoft Teams. And the breadth of the services in the platform continue to expand, right? We all use one or more of these services every day, even if it's something as simple as the Office suite. And so as we begin to think about that, right, 250 million users out there, 75 million users out there every day in Teams, we're creating content, we're collaborating on content, we're sharing on content. Where's all that content going? Well, it's not all in SharePoint, right? You might think that's the logical place that everything would be put, in Microsoft 365, but everything doesn't go into SharePoint Online automatically. Content gets stored in many locations in Microsoft 365. The other thing is Microsoft 365 is really helpful, and so it tries to help out sometimes by auto-saving things for you. So it may be saving copies of documents into your OneDrive or into a SharePoint location or to your local file system that you didn't realize before you go to save your actual working draft copy somewhere else. So what can happen over time is content winds up being in different locations. So Teams, for example, Teams creates a SharePoint site. When you set up a team, there's a SharePoint site created behind it to store content in. If you go to the top, there's a little option up there that says Files. That's the SharePoint site for the team. And if you drill a little deeper, there's an option to actually open that in SharePoint. If you add files to a Teams chat, it actually stores them not in the SharePoint site, but into your personal OneDrive. Email, right? Well, we all know that email can have attachments, right? We all get emails with one or more attachments to them. But did you know users can also export their inbox and all of their subfolders to a PST file? And that PST file then gets stored on their desktop or on their drive somewhere. Or IT can set up archives for email. So emails that I may want to keep, but I don't want my active inbox, I can drag into my archive. Well, archives can have quotas, which is great, except the quotas can be self-expanding. When I hit my quota, instead of it cutting me off, it'll just expand and give me more, which, as a user, that's great, but from a compliance standpoint, a little more concerning. And then there's OneDrive, right? How many OneDrive locations are there in your organization? Right? How many employees do you have out there? How many users in your Microsoft 365 environment are there? They've all got OneDrive locations. And what all do they store out there? Right? So content can wind up in a lot of places. And here's a couple of examples. Microsoft Teams. I was having a chat with John the other day, and I said, hey, have you seen these documents? And so I dragged 2 documents directly into the chat from my desktop. They were on my C drive. Dropped them into the chat. John can download them and take a look at them now and save them on his desktop. But at the same time, in my OneDrive in Microsoft 365, there's now a folder called Microsoft Teams chat files, and a copy of those documents is placed there for me. 1, did you know that? And 2, have you ever gone and deleted anything out of that Microsoft Teams chat files? And if John then shares that with somebody else during one of his chats, there's another copy of the document out there. So you begin to see the challenge. Email is the same problem, right? As I mentioned, we have our inbox, we get a lot of emails coming in. Our emails will have attachments, 1 or more attachments. IT can set up the email archive. We can drag stuff into our archive. Do you know what's hidden in all of those attachments over time? If you go back and look at emails from a year ago or 2 years ago, do you know what some of those attachments are without actually opening them up and looking at them? Probably not. And then we talked about PST files. PST files haven't gone away. Users can still export their inbox out to a PST file. That PST file is stored on their local drive or somewhere on the network drive, and they can attach that to their Outlook and have permanent access to their emails. More importantly, a user can carry that PST file with them if they leave the company and go to another company, or an employee comes to your company and maybe they've got a bunch of stuff from their old company they want to reference. They've got their PST file, they just attach it to their corporate Outlook so they can have reference, not with any malicious intent, but does that now expose your organization to having information in a user's Outlook that is not your IP, right? So there's all these kind of challenges that start to come up. And then there's OneDrive. Well, first of all, there's not just one OneDrive. There's 2 OneDrives, which is kind of confusing. But there's personal OneDrive, which is the OneDrive associated to you as a user. It'll sync with Windows Explorer, right, and allow you to have access to documents offline. You can access it through the web browser. And it's really designed to be your personal work area for draft content, for work in progress content that you are working on before you're really ready to collaborate more broadly. The idea is when you're really ready to collaborate, then you move it into SharePoint, and now your team works on it together, and you can all, collaborate simultaneously through Microsoft Word. But what happens is a lot of people wind up using their personal OneDrive as a personal document management system with these massive nested structures. And the problem with OneDrive is it's hard to share information, or hard for other users to find information unless you have shared it with them. And then OneDrive for Business, a little cleaner, a little nicer, because OneDrive for Business syncs to a SharePoint library. So I can have any SharePoint library sync to my OneDrive for Business location. Now I have access to all of the documents in that SharePoint library offline. If I add a document to my OneDrive for Business library, it's going to get synced back up to SharePoint. And retention and locking and disposition of those files in OneDrive for Business actually gets controlled through the SharePoint side. So that's a little more controlled, unlike the personal OneDrive. And so what happens is we wind up with information chaos, right? And I'll throw a little trivia question out there. If you have an idea where the picture comes from there, type it in the chat. We'll give a shout out later if somebody gets it correct. But it's information chaos. Stuff is moving everywhere, right? Content's flowing every which direction, and it becomes very, very confusing, right? It's all moving so fast. Where's the latest version of my information? Is it in OneDrive? Did I put it in SharePoint? Did somebody email me a copy? Did somebody else email a copy to somebody else? Where's the master copy at now? How many copies are there out there? Is sensitive information being stored properly, right? All of these documents in all of these different locations, do they contain PII data? Do they have Social Security information in them? Do they have credit card information? Do they have sensitive information to the organization, like products that are in development, things like that? What about privacy requests, right? GDPR, CCPA, and other privacy laws say that I can request you remove all of my information from your network. How do you go out and find every document in your network that contains an email address so that I can find actually find, all of Shana's information? And Jeanette got the answer right. That's actually Shibuya Crossing in Tokyo. One of the busiest intersections in the world, kind of like our network. And then, are you at risk, right? Is information getting disposed of where it belongs, right? How long is information being kept, especially if it's being copied into locations I didn't even know about, like Teams chats? Right, and then how many different places does content exist? Is it in OneDrive? Is it in PST files and so forth? That's where file analysis comes into play, right? It helps you make better decisions about your content and where your content is. So the definition of file analysis, not according to Gimmal, but according to Gartner Group, there's a reference to the report there at the bottom of the slide. File analysis are products that analyze, index, search, track, and report on file metadata and file content. And they enable organizations to take actions on files according to what was identified. So it helps you understand through analysis, search, reporting, what's out there, what the metadata is about that content, and lets you make more intelligent decisions about what to do with that content. And that's what Gimmal Altitude does, right? It helps you discover information. It helps you go out there and look across all of these different data sources and discover the information that's out there. Number one, how many different targets are there out there in those data sources? To analyze that information and inspect it. Look for patterns that match PII information. Look for terms that may match confidential, unclassified information, for example, and be able to report or classify the information, assign classification labels if you need to, and allow you to respond to data requests, because now you know where the information is. You know where all of your documents that may contain email addresses are, for example. Gimmal Altitude is all about governing your data and helping you comply with your policies, right? Discover, remediate, and classify. So get visibility into the different locations that you have, identify the data sources and the individual targets, be able to analyze that data, and more importantly, report back on what it is that we found as we did the reporting. And so we're going to do a little click-through demo. And in a short webinar like this, we don't really have time to do a live demo, but I'm going to do a click-through so you can get an idea of what type of analysis we can do here. And as I go through this, feel free to type questions in the Q&A box, and we'll make sure we get to those at the end of the webinar. So this is Gimmal Altitude, right? It is a SaaS platform. It's all web-based. As a business analyst, as an IT analyst, I just come in through the browser and I access Gimmal Altitude, and I can run all types of file analytics. Well, the way Gimmal Altitude works, because it is a SaaS platform, it uses connectors to reach into your network. The connectors are the only thing that install into your organization, and the connectors then deploy out and allow me to reach into different data sources. And those data sources, specifically today, we're talking about Microsoft 365. Those data sources can be things like Exchange Web Services, all my Exchange Online mailboxes. Could be all of my OneDrive locations in Microsoft 365. Can be using the MAPI connector, looking across the network for either inboxes in Exchange on-prem or PST files that are out on my network, as well as SharePoint sites, both SharePoint Online and SharePoint on-premise. And then Altitude can connect to other data sources here, as you see. And the idea is when I first connect to a data source, right, I had one client we were talking with, and they said, one of the biggest challenges we have is we don't even know how many OneDrive locations we have out there. That's problem number one, and getting that information wasn't easy. Well, Altitude goes out, and the first thing it does with a data source is perform a search and come back and give me a list of all of the individual targets within that data source. So with OneDrive, for example, go search my OneDrive, come back and say, here are all of the OneDrive locations that are in my Microsoft 365 tenant. Now I can see when they were last updated, when somebody last used them, how much information is out there, how many of them might be dormant, which ones I should get rid of. It gives me that visibility. And I can do that for all of my data targets and begin to build, whoops, one too quick there. I can begin to build a list of all of the data targets across my different Microsoft 365 data sources. Here I have OneDrive locations. Here I have some PST files out on my network. Here I have my different SharePoint sites out there. I've got some file paths on Windows on my file shares, as well as on personal drives, right? Because you notice the PST files I actually analyzed and found on Dean's laptop. So I can begin to build up this visibility and this list of my information that's out there, and I can see all of my different data sources. So now I can begin to do analytics. I can set up analytic policies, and I can set up analytic workflows to go out and look at these data sources and these data targets, and I can be selective. I don't have to go analyze every OneDrive location in the company or every email inbox. I can say, well, you know what? I'm only concerned about marketing. I'm only going to go analyze Indira and Shayna's OneDrive locations and their inbox locations, looking for specific information. Right? I can be very selective in that way. And so the data governance side of Altitude allows me to come in to create a policy that says, okay, I want to go look at all of my OneDrive locations, and I want to find files in OneDrive that are over 3 years old. Right? Because anything that old shouldn't still be sitting in OneDrive. It's supposed to be for draft information. What about my emails? I want to go out and search my PST files and look for anything sitting in PST files that's over 4 years old, or maybe that contains certain terms. If you look down the very last policy there, I'm actually going to go out and search email inboxes, and I'm going to look for personal credit information or I'm going to look for Social Security numbers. And if I don't find either one of those, I'm going to look for emails that are in my active inboxes that are over 2 years old. So I can begin to set up these types of analytics, run those, and at the end of the analytic, I get the analytic policy, I get a report where I can view the information and I can see what's out there. So here's my report for my PST files. I went out and I said, find everything that exists in PST files that's over 4 years old. And so here I see, and I can configure the reports to return whatever information I need. And it'll vary depending on the data source, right? If I'm in SharePoint, I can get site name and content type and, list name and things like that. If I'm an email, I can get sender's name, sender's date, or the sent date, the sent to, the subject, things like that. It'll vary depending on the data source. But here I can see in my PST files, what was the date the email was received? Who sent it? What was their email address? Who was it sent to? What was the subject of the email, right? I can begin to see all that information. Or when I go out and I do a search on my Exchange mailboxes, looking for PCI or Social Security information, I said, return a different set of information. Tell me whose mailbox this information is in. I did multiple tests. I did both an age-based test as well as a PII test. Tell me which test was positive. Well, some of the emails are older than 2 years. Some of the emails have PCI information in them, right? So I can have the analytic workflow return that information. What's the subject of the email? Again, who was the sender? Who was it sent to? When was that email received? And you notice the little lavender or pink squares out to the left. I can even have Altitude do full text analysis of emails and files that it analyzes so that I can click and actually view the full text information of not just the email, but also any attachments in the email. Kind of going back to that, do you know actually what's in the attachments of your emails? So again, I begin to get this visibility into the information that's out there. I can start to generate kind of overall view reports in addition to the individual analytic reports. I can start to look at my data overall and look at things like, okay, I've got all this data out there. Show me my file size by age. And you know what? I'm in good shape. The vast majority of my files are less than 3 years old or less than 6 years old. I've only got very, very few files that are older than 10 years. That's probably a good thing, right? So I'm doing a pretty good job of managing my data and keeping my files fairly fresh. I can also generate trend reports. Right, so again, I can begin to periodically run a trend analysis and see at snapshots in time, how is the volume of my data changing or the volume of my emails changing, right? There are different trend reports. This one just looks at trend by count, number of files. And so we launched Altitude mid-year last year. I first configured it. I had very few data sources. So we had a fairly low count. Then we ran the next analysis and it jumped up quite a bit because we added a lot more data sources. But as we've run additional trend analysis over time, we see that the volume count on the number of files and emails, kind of very fine there at the bottom, is actually dropping. The trend's going in the right direction. That's what we need to be able to see. That's what we need to be able to report on, in addition to the specifics around the individual, the individual analytics. So this was a bit of a click through. Here's our first poll. Here's our poll question. This was a click through demonstration because of the time. If you'd like to see a more in-depth personal demonstration of Gimmal Altitude, we would be happy to set that up. Just click on the box, and usually, 30 to 45 minutes, we can give you a really good deep dive into Altitude, show how the analytic policies and workflows are set up and how things are configured, and really let you see the power of the platform as well as some of the other capabilities that we didn't touch on here today. So if you'd like to see that in more depth, just click here on the answer and we'll capture that, and someone from Gimmal will follow up with you after the webinar. So while we're waiting on the poll question to finish up, Shana, do you want to start in on the Q&A?
Yeah, so we have a couple in the Q&A box right now, so I'm just going to start rattling them off. The first one we have, good question. Would Gimmal altitude be used by all staff or just the information governance and records management staff?
Yeah, I don't think it would be used by all staff. Like every user in the company, I don't think would use altitude. Um, I think it would be more used by a business analyst or an IT analyst or maybe somebody in compliance. Probably a subset of people who really need to go out and do some type of analysis and discover and find information, whether it's for managing resources, whether it's for managing, ensuring compliance, or just for security purposes, right? To make sure there's nothing like we had one client, I showed them altitude and they went, so I could point this at my network log and look for suspicious patterns of IP addresses. I'd never thought of that, but I'm like, yeah, actually, you probably could. So a lot of creative ways you could use it, but I don't think it would be used by every person in the organization.
Okay, and then I see a hand raised just for the sheer volume of attendees we have. We choose not to unmute because it could get a little chaotic. So if you do have a question, just make sure you type it into that Q&A section on your screen, and then we'll get to it. So the second one we have is, does Altitude work with older versions of SharePoint? Meaning, can it detect SharePoint 2013 sites, for example, or is it limited to the newer versions of SharePoint?
It will work with older versions of SharePoint. So I know it supports 2013, 2016, 2019, as well as Microsoft 365. 2010 is now off support, so I would have to double check to see if there's still any support for 2010. But I know it does do those other older versions.
Okay, and then we have another one. What is the speed of analytics reporting when using the full text option?
Yeah, that's a great question, by the way. If you're analyzing, terabytes of information or, even 20, 30, 40 gigs of information, it takes time, just physics to go through each file and do some analysis. So if you add full text, that adds a little overhead. It doesn't like, double or triple the time. It's 10, 15, 20% of the time, quite frankly. And the type of analytics you're doing come into play as well. If you're doing, using things like regular expressions to do pattern matching, that adds a little overhead versus if you're just looking at things like age or, information like that or file owner or things like that. So, and in the analytics, there are ways you can, again, make that more efficient. So, maybe there are certain inboxes I know I don't need to analyze. I could ignore those. Or if there are certain folder names that are things like temp or junk, right? I don't need to go analyze the junk folders of every inbox because I know it's quite frankly junk. So you can put filters in like that to say, oh, if a file or a location meets a certain criteria, don't analyze it, just move on to the next one. And that helps with that efficiency. So great question.
Okay, so that ran through all the chat questions. If you can think of any more questions that later, both of our email addresses are right there on the screen. If you want to move on to the next slide, Dean, you can also visit us at our website right there on the screen or general questions, info@gimmal.com. For those interested in the recording of today's webinar, we usually send them out in the form of a thank you email in your inbox. So keep an eye out for that between 24 to 48 hours. And we hope to see many of you back for our webinar next week, making the move to electronic records management. We appreciate you joining today and have a great rest of your day.